Hello and welcome to TEDx San Antonio Red Dot Cafe. I'm Jacqueline Carmona, your executive producer and host for today's event. Please join our conversation by leaving questions or leave a comment in the comment section and tell us your ideas. We are happy to be joined today by our 2013 TEDxCanmore Speaker Gemma Stone, who is the president of Gemma Stone International. Gemma Stone is a registered psychologist, curious neuroscientist, speaker, and author who is focused on helping people build resilience and emotional intelligence so they can love themselves, others, and the world a little more. In addition to her psychology practice, she facilitates retreats in the Rocky Mountains and consults with organizations internationally. She is the author of Your Great Life, a soulful and strategic guide to designing life you love. To designing a life you love. When she's not working, you can find Gemma adventuring the world with her two sons, or her favorite fountain pen, or in a corner with her favorite fountain pen, working on her next book. Let's welcome Gemma Stone.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm so delighted to be here.
Thank you for coming on and discussing this very important subject. I wanted to start with explaining the difference between between a psychologist and a neuroscientist.
Yeah, of course. So psychology tends to be people who are experts in the field of brain and sometimes body, also certainly connected to emotions. So people who are registered psychologists tend to be regulated by a governing body. They often have a biopsychosocial approach to helping people figure out their thoughts, their feelings, their actions. And a lot of times they are primarily involved in therapy. Whereas a neuroscientist is often a scientist and a researcher, and they're really interested in the nervous system. So they're primarily focused on biology, really looking at brain, spinal cord, nerve cells, and often they're in academia. Sometimes they also are involved in therapy. And they're really curious about how the brain works, how it impacts thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And they're also looking to understand the vast world of our brain that we just know so little about. So that's the primary difference between the two.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. How did you come about choosing the discipline of the psychologists, and what interests you in your neuroscientists?
Yeah. Well, I actually think that most people get into psychology because they're trying to figure themselves out. So I was certainly in that category. I experienced a lot of mental health struggles when I was younger. And I also felt like the first psychology course I took, I felt like I had come home. Like there was a sense of recognition. It felt familiar. I was vastly curious about it. And it also seemed like there was an infinite amount of information and subjects that I could explore. So I dove into psychology first. And I took a pretty academic route in the beginning and a very science-based orientation towards psychology. And then later on in my work, I came to understand that psychopathology originally means to study the suffering of the soul. So I took a little detour and I started exploring more the soulful side of psychology. And that's a little bit less grounded in science, but really grounded in humanity and this sort of wild ride that we're on, and the ups and downs of it. So I studied the more sort of soulful side of psychology for a little while, and then I came full circle back to science and was really curious about how the brain works. I became passionate about helping people with trauma, and trauma really impacts our nervous system. And so to that end, I really needed to understand a little bit more about the nervous system and how our brains are wired and what causes our brains to develop in certain ways that can cause specific mental health disorders. So I kind of been full circle from science to soul and back to science.
That's very interesting, because I also have a degree in psychology, so I've always been interested in studying people and understanding why they think a certain way. That's always been intriguing to me. Tell me a little bit about the patients who seek your help.
Yeah, the clients that I work with, they tend to be doing fairly well in life, but there are some areas in which they're struggling. So often they can hold a job or they have relationships, but there's this sort of underlying sense of struggle. Sometimes there's a feeling of self-sabotage. A lot of my clients have experienced trauma in the past, and trauma has a way of sort of keeping us stuck in life and stuck in particular survival strategies. So those survival strategies and those defense mechanisms can manifest as anxiety, fear, depression. People that are going through a big life transition, so maybe they've lost a loved one, or they're navigating or contemplating divorce, or they've lost their job. And sometimes there's just this sense of like, I don't know who I am, and I feel really disconnected from life. And there's this motivation to want to drop into a place that feels more fulfilling, where there's more aliveness and less of this stagnation and stuckness.
So what's the difference between the people who seek therapy and don't seek therapy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, wonderfully, I think what I've noticed lately is that more and more people are willing to seek therapy. And I think it's because there's a greater degree of exposure and less stigmatization around mental health. I mean, pretty much everybody I know in the last 2 years has struggled with their mental health in some way. So in a lot of ways, the people that seek out therapy, they've had some type of exposure to therapy. So maybe they've watched it on a television show, or they have a family member that went to therapy, or maybe their doctors recommended it, but there's been some exposure. And then the second is that there's resource. So they have the time, they have the energy, they have the money, they have the ability to get to therapy. And then the third is usually the awareness of what therapy can help with, and why somebody would go to therapy. So those are the three things that tend to draw people to therapy. In terms of people who don't go to therapy, I think primarily it's about, well, historically it's been about stigma. A lot of times people feel like maybe they don't need it, or there's practical challenges that get in the way. So that might be, again, time, money, availability, finding the right therapist. Some people are scared of therapy. I know sometimes when I introduce myself as a psychologist, people are like, "Oh, like don't read my mind, or don't shrink me." So I think there has been some fear historically around therapy. Maybe they've had a past bad experience. I've encountered some people who have maybe had a therapist that wasn't quite the right fit for them, and so they had a negative experience and they feel some trepidation about trying again. Or other people feel like they can just do it on their own. So those tend to be the reasons why people don't go to therapy.
So what are some encouraging factors you've seen personally that worked for people to go to therapy?
Well, encouraging factors, I think, come to having a really good fit between the client and the therapist. There's a lot of different modalities out there, and philosophies and orientations and cultures when it comes to therapy. And so the most important thing that we know for sure is that therapist-client fit is the number one factor. So there's been some really interesting research about the different types of therapy that are the most effective. And ultimately, nothing matters more than your relationship with your therapist. So that's number one, is really encouraging people to find somebody who is a really good fit for them and they feel alignment with, as well as a sense of safety and being understood. And there's something called unconditional positive regard. So there's this feeling of being welcomed for all of who you are and everything that you're struggling with, and being able to receive that warmly, while also, of course, having the skills necessary to be able to help with a particular issue that you're struggling with. In terms of what I think is helpful for getting people to therapy in general, I think it's really important that we talk openly about it. So across the board, with my friends, with my family, with my clients, even on social media, I'm often talking about how I go to therapy. And I think the more people who talk about going to therapy, the more normalized it becomes. So I really, when I do work with organizations, I'm really encouraging the leaders to have a therapy day be the same as a doctor's appointment, or have people publicly, when they feel comfortable, sharing, oh, I'm going to be late for work this morning because I'm going to my therapist. So just really normalizing it, having it be part of the dialogue around health is important. I also think as therapists, as psychologists, as people in mental health professionals, I think the more that we can do to educate people around the benefits of therapy, and when you would want to seek out therapy, I think that's really helpful. And then finally, I think accessibility is really important in terms of helping people get to therapy. So finding different ways to make therapy accessible in terms of time or geography or money. I think that's another element that would be really beneficial for people. There's a lot of movements right now, which are thrilling, that are helping to normalize therapy. Things like bring change to mind, or stamp out stigma, or make it okay. There's another one called This Is My Brave, or How Are You Really, which is one of my favorite questions. So how are you really is a movement, but it's also just a great question to ask people, how are you really? Because then I think it allows us to get into the nitty gritty of what it's like to be human these days and the places in which we're struggling. So I think those are the combination of factors that would make it a little bit easier for people to get to therapy and feel like mental health can be normalized a little more than it currently is.
We have a question here. It says here, do you believe the division between medical care and mental health care and practitioners hurt patients' outcomes? There seems to be so much overlap and interplay between them, but not as much cooperation.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. I think if we could have more collaborative care, it would be really helpful for clients, because there's ways in which I'm limited, for example. So I don't prescribe medication, but it would be really helpful for me to be in relationship with the person who is prescribing medication if I have a client who's taking medication. I think that the more comprehensive approach to overall well-being is probably the most effective, because we can't really divide the mind and the body. We know that there's a mind-body connection. And I think the more the people who are the professionals of the body can support the people who are the professionals of the mind, and vice versa, the more comprehensive the care can be. I also find that there's a gap. So if there's a gap between service or connection with the professionals, sometimes clients can fall through the cracks. So in my ideal world, there would be some type of very smooth, effortless, comprehensive system where we could assess what's happening for a client mentally, emotionally, physically, relationally, and then provide a treatment plan that really makes sense, and that feels complete, and where everybody feels like they're on the same page and there's no balls dropped or wires crossed, and there's really clear communication to support our clients.
So one of the questions we talked about is how to normalize therapy, because there's so much stigma
Mhm.
behind therapy. Also, there's fears, like you just said, when you introduce yourself as a therapist, people are scared that you're going to read their mind or understand their troubles, or, call them out and who they really are, their imposter self, right?
Yeah.
So I only imagine, like, when you're sitting in therapy and there's that awkwardness of quiet, and you're talking and spilling all of your emotions to this stranger, and they're just continuing writing and writing and writing and nodding their head, and then ask a quick question, and then you just continue pouring yourself out, and then there's this awkward silence again. I've heard so many people in therapy say that, and I know there's a name for that,
Mhm.
not having like an emotional involvement with the patients. And can you talk a little bit about that and the fears that people have when they're in therapy and they're actually going through these motions? And it's intimidating. It's an intimidating process to talk about things that are very private to a perfect stranger, and you don't know how this therapy session it's going to go, or how what the other person is thinking, because we always want some type of, when we're interacting, talking to people, we want someone to say something so we can understand what they're thinking about what we're saying. So I can only imagine that's one of the fears that people have during therapy. Can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, for sure. I love that you name that, because I think it's really legitimate. It's a fear I think that a lot of people struggle with. I think it's a reality that a lot of people have faced in therapy as well. So old school therapy was a lot more about having, like, not really having much of a self as a therapist. So they had this phrase, it was tabula rasa. So you're just a blank slate and you don't really bring any of yourself into the therapy, aside from your training. And so there's you can probably imagine sort of the image of usually like a Freudian type analysis, where they're sitting behind the client and the client is just like laying on the couch pouring out their hearts, and there's not really a lot of engagement from the therapist. I think there are still some therapists that work that way, but one of the things I've noticed in the last, because I've been working in the field of psychology for about 20 years now, one of the things I've noticed more recently is there is a trend towards therapists bringing more of themselves into the therapeutic relationship. And it always has to be in benefit and service to the clients and the client's outcomes. But there's more permission now for me to say, for example, like if I notice that a client is feeling really awkward about sharing something vulnerable and they have a fear of being judged, I might share like, I've really struggled with mental health in the past. And in fact, the reason I went to therapy or became a psychologist was because I was trying to figure out my stuff. And so anything you've told, if you're going to tell me, like I've probably experienced or done worse. So like no judgment. And so sometimes I find like these little stories or these little tiny like droplets of my own humanity dropped into the therapeutic relationship can really serve and support this sense of safety and opening up, and for the client to know that they're not alone and that there's nothing broken inside of them and they're not wrong or bad for having these thoughts or doing these things, but just like the human experience is messy and it's complicated. And I think the more people understand that they're not alone in those messy complexities, I think the safer they feel in being able to be more vulnerable. And ultimately, vulnerability paced in the right way at the right time with the right amount of safety is one of the most important factors for being able to really get into some deep healing. And so for me, creating that the safety and the permission of vulnerability, and also having clients be seen, heard, and met in that and know that they're not alone, can help sometimes with that feeling of pouring out their heart and just like hoping for a little bit of acknowledgement or validation around that tricky human experience.
So we have another question. Can you talk about group versus individual therapy and pros and cons, issues or indications for one or the other?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, especially because of what we're going through right now as a collective. So group therapy, I think, is really beneficial when it comes to two things. So one is the sense of not being alone. One thing that adds to the trauma of the human experience when we go through hard things is the feeling of not being in connection. So if we go through something traumatic and we're in connection in a way that's resourcing, then we're more likely to experience post-traumatic growth instead of post-traumatic stress. So if you're going through something, connecting with other people that are experiencing something similar or have been through something similar can really be a protective factor. Another benefit to group therapy, which is actually kind of complicated, but really, really beneficial, is that the things that happen in relationship that hurt us also often heal in relationships. So one of the things we notice as group therapists is that we'll notice family dynamics playing out within the group. And so if somebody is there who's skilled at facilitating that and can hold the space and work the dynamic, then often a level of healing is available that's not available in an individual session, because you're not going to have those group dynamics or family dynamics playing out. So those would be the two reasons I would say group therapy. The other side of it is individual therapy. So for people who have like a kind of a specific need, and they're really wanting to focus on a personalized treatment approach to whatever it is that they're going through, that can be a really helpful option when it comes to individual therapy. Another thing that can be really important with individual therapy is if you have had experiences in your life where you are always the caregiver, where you're the one who's like the rescuer or the rock, sometimes it can be really beneficial to have the experience of having another human hold you. So you're not the one. So sometimes that type of individual in a group therapy session won't get as much out of it because they're so busy trying to fix, help, save, rescue all the other people in the group that they actually don't get their own therapeutic experience. So that would be another reason why I would recommend individual therapy as well.
So in your experience in treating patients, have you noticed a difference in certain ethnic groups versus other groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are certainly differences. So in terms of different ethnic groups or people that have been marginalized or minorities, our culture impacts whether or not we seek help. By culture, I mean everything. I mean our race, our ethnicity, our culture, our sexual orientation, our sexual identity, like all the different factors that make us us can influence whether or not we seek help. It can influence what type of help that we seek. It can influence what our coping styles are, whether or not we have access to social support or not, or stigmas connected to mental health. So people from different cultures definitely have different experiences in therapy, and also in terms of mental health. So one of the things that we've noticed is it seems like marginalized people or minorities are less likely to experience or seek out mental health treatment. And sometimes that's because it's not as culturally appropriate. Sometimes it's because there's other resources available. So community leaders or religious supports or family or friends or traditional healers, like those are more the places that are more accessible or sometimes more appropriate for mental health support. In terms of mental health across different ethnic groups, there are some things that are similar for mental health. So things like schizophrenia or bipolar or panic disorder, those tend to be fairly stable across different groups. But there are some things that are different. So things like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide, those things do tend to be influenced by culture. There are definitely experiences that people from different gender backgrounds or sexual orientation or ethnic groups struggle with a little bit more in terms of getting mental health support. So sometimes it's accessibility of high quality, highly trained professionals. Sometimes it's the cultural stigma about seeking out mental health can be a bit of a barrier. Sometimes there's unconscious biases or there's outright discrimination that can happen within mental health, or inequities in social economic status can also be a barrier. And then when we look at like different groups of people, we notice that there are more specific mental health challenges. So for example, First Nations people tend to have disproportionately higher rates of some mental health struggles. And right now what it looks like is that's because of the multi-generational issues around trauma that have impacted the nervous system. And so that's something that we notice. Also, people who are LGBTQ plus are more than twice as likely to have some type of mental health disorder compared to people who are heterosexual or interested more in monosexual individuals. So there's a lot of variance in terms of mental health when it comes to different cultural groups. And I think the most important thing here is that there's a desperate need really for culturally competent service with a diversity of therapists who can really specifically have sought out training and have had even similar lived experiences from of clients that are in different cultural groups.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about your book, Your Great Life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a book that I wrote when I was a little bit more in the soulful phase of my psychology journey. So one of the things that I noticed is that early in my life, I had a lot of mental health struggles. And as I was starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together for me, one of the things I noticed was that the more disconnected I became to something that's called your essential self, the more I struggled. So I struggled with depression and anxiety and panic attacks and eating disorders. And as I started exploring both the psychology and the science of self, as well as the soulful side of self, I came to realize that the blending of the two, the strategic and scientific side of psychology, as well as the soulful side of psychology, felt like it was the cleanest path forward for myself. And that was the journey that I took. And then as I took that journey, I sort of looked back and realized that a lot of my clients seemed to benefit both from the blending of strategy and science and soul, and then also the people that I loved. So there's lots of people that like my sister and friends who had gone through this journey of sort of feeling very disconnected from their authentic self and getting further and further and further away from that. And the greater the gap was between the authentic self and the lived experience, the more suffering there was. So I decided to write a book that was a little bit like a guidebook for kind of getting back on your path and feeling more aligned with your true self. And I also filled that book with things that were supportive for me and for my clients. So there's exercises and there's prompts. It's a little bit like a book and a workbook all in one. And the idea is that we can design lives that are in alignment with who we truly are, the essence of who we are. And the more that we consciously redesign our lives as many times as we need to, the more aliveness and happiness and fulfillment and health we tend to experience. So that's what the book's all about.
So interesting. We have another question. Would it benefit dispelling the stigma? Oh, I skipped over one. So let's go with the first one. Are you familiar with tattoo therapy and how it works? I've heard that it used to treat trauma, but find it confusing as to why an individual will seek this type of therapy.
What was the type of therapy she mentioned?
Tattoo therapy.
Tattoo therapy. I have never I've never heard of tattoo therapy. So I'm going to take a guess at what it means. I probably think it has something to do with actual tattoos. If I'm wrong about this, please forgive me. But I've never heard of it before. However, I have worked with people, and I myself have found that tattoos can be a really meaningful way to make sense of life and to stay grounded in what matters. So when we're looking at some of the protective factors for post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the protective factors is how we make sense of what we've been through. And so I have some friends and some clients, as well as myself, decided once I've made it through something really challenging, one of the ways I made sense of it ended up getting inked on my skin. And similar for these other people. So sometimes it can be like a marking of what you've been through and how you've chose to make sense of it, which is a protective factor for mental health. And then also I've noticed some people, so I've ran retreats and things like that before. And often in those retreats, people will come across something that feels like they never want to forget it. And if they remember that one thing every day of their life, then they are going to be taking care of their mental health, and they're going to be living more in alignment with the lives that they love. And so they've decided to get that inked on their skin. So I don't know what tattoo therapy is, but I know people that have used tattoos in therapeutic ways. And I think the most important thing there is if you choose to get a tattoo, that it's something that feels like it's a meaningful reminder of who you want to be or how you want to live, or it's a way that you've made sense of what you've been through.
Yes, I've seen, so I don't have tattoos, but I've seen very close friends and families that have gotten tattoo and to mark a special occasion or something that was very meaningful to them, a person, a relative. So I've seen mom tattoos. I've seen so many different tattoos, and I'm thinking that's exactly what the question was about. Hopefully we were both right about that. Would it benefit dispelling the stigma if more people knew that therapists themselves seek therapy? Why has that been part of a greater dialogue regarding dispelling the stigma?
Yeah, I think that's so many brilliant questions in here. I think that's a really important question. I think there's a couple of reasons for it. So one is that I believe it's only been more recently where in psychology training, therapists have been encouraged to bring more of themselves to therapy. I actually think that social media has a lot to do with this. We're seeing a lot more mental health professionals on social media that are bringing more of themselves to the mental health content. I think that there is a legacy of therapists not really being encouraged to have a full self, and there's been a fear of being maybe too vulnerable or too public, or losing credibility or losing a sense of professionalism. So I think the old narrative was, if my therapist goes to therapy, like, are they too messed up to help me? I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think that therapists should have to go to therapy. There are some organizations, so a lot of therapists that are licensed have regulatory bodies that tell us how much training we have to do and how we need to stay current. And there are some organizations and regulatory bodies that require a certain number of therapy hours, which I think is really wise. I think that before people should be able to engage in therapy with others, I think they need to have been through therapy themselves. And I think that we're seeing that a little bit more. But to answer the question, I think that it would really help to normalize therapy and mental health if the mental health professionals were more transparent about their journey with mental health and their experience with therapy.
I totally agree. There's the stigma if a professional is seeking therapy themselves, they're unstable or won't be able to help me, or don't have everything together themselves. So why should I go to that person? But we're all humans, and we all have something that we have to work through and grow as a person as we travel through, have this journey in life. So I totally agree with that. Yes, we all have a journey, and no one's journey is going to be perfect.
Exactly. And I think actually my experience with therapists, both because I work with therapists professionally, so some people call me like the psychologist for psychologists. So I work with a lot of professionals, as well as I've been to therapy a lot. And I've also trained different therapists. And my experience is that it's the therapists that go to therapy that are the best therapists, either because they have the lived experience of whatever the hard thing is that their clients are going through, and so they can approach it from a different angle, or they have the benefit of knowing what it's like to be in therapy. And so they're going to be sensitive and attuned to those moments where there's the awkward silence, like you mentioned earlier, Jacqueline. Like they're gonna know what that feels like, and they're gonna be more sensitive to their client's experience. So it's not 100% thing, but I will only go to therapy with therapists that are also going to therapy.
It's good to know. So there's another one, and we're moving on to the last question. I just read Oprah's book with a trauma specialist that talked about why people cut. It gives a little dopamine hit to people who have experienced certain types of trauma. Wonder whether it's similar. And the name of the book is What Happened to You, if I'm correct, because it's in another thread. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and you're so right about that. Like the ways in which we figure out how to give ourselves dopamine hits is phenomenal. Like we are such resourceful creatures. So you're right that the cutting often creates a sense of relief. Sometimes it creates a sense of control. Sometimes it's a distraction. So sometimes the emotional pain is so intense, the physical pain is a distraction. It can create the sense of like a dopamine rush, which also helps. And also adrenaline and cortisol can be released, which helps to numb some of the painful feelings. So there's all these different ways that I call them survival strategies, all these different ways we've learned to cope with our trauma. So some people turn to cutting, some people turn to addiction. So any types of drugs or alcohol can also support in not such a healthy way, but in a way that can sometimes make it a little bit more manageable. Some people, their challenge goes more to like depression, and they start to like numb out and just feel like really disconnected from their emotions. Other people, their survival strategy is more anxiety. So they get sort of really anxious and overwhelmed, and they get really busy, or they become workaholics. So there's all these different survival strategies that we use to both try to manage the pain that we're in, as well as try to cope with the hard things. And so one of my passions is really helping people to build resilience and regulation, because when we're in a state of resilience and regulation, we don't need as many of those unhealthy survival strategies to deal with the harder aspects of being human.
Well, we reached at the end of our time, and I would like to give you our audience an opportunity to find out how they can get in touch with you, your contact information, or any way they can get in contact with you, or perhaps seek therapy.
Yeah. So most of my work is over at www.gemmastone.org. And then from there, you can find the places where we have the book is there, and then the private practice is an offshoot of that. And then we have some courses that are there as well. So, and then also, of course, just reach out. Like I'm happy to answer questions and provide. I can't do therapy with everybody, but I can sometimes point you in the right direction of a great book or a great therapist near you, or another resource that might be supportive for you on your journey.
Well, thank you, Gemma. It's been a pleasure to have you on and have this serious discussion about mental health. I know a lot of people don't like seeking mental health, and you dispelled a little bit about the reasons why, and perhaps we can change some attitude towards it and motivate people to seek some therapy, or be a little bit more more sensitive to other people's needs and to therapy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted that you're featuring and spotlighting therapy and mental health. I think more than ever, like this is the season that we really, really need it to be something that's more accessible for people. So thank you so much for being part of that shift, and also for inviting me into this conversation. It's been a delight.
Well, thank you. Many thanks again to Gemma Stone for joining us today. Do you have any, well, we already talked about your book, so we thank her and hope you tune in again next month for another program. Thank you.